been watching my previous videos, I'm pretty sure it's very obvious how much I like good stories in Pokemon games. I've talked about it in, my video on Ultra Sun and Moon, how much the story of the original Sun and Moon means to me. Of course, there's Mystery Dungeon. It's literally the banner in my YouTube channel, but that everyone can kind of agree that the story is one of its main appeals. But I do have the sort of hot take-ish opinion that a good script can enhance a Pokemon game like tenfold. And I know, usually Pokemon is one of those RPGs that people won't play for the story, what do you want from a Pokemon story, dang it. But my logic has always been that what makes an RPG good is the whole role-playing of it, and not just as in acting out your character in a world and doing your thing, but actually feeling like a part of it. I can enjoy the gameplay. I think the gameplay is really important for an RPG, or else you'd rather just watch a movie or read a book. But it's the crossing over between the interactivity and the context and world in there to justify your interactivity, so it really feels like you're playing a part in this world, even if there's not that much customizability or diverging paths in the story. That's why I think personally games like Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee are kind of a snooze fest. That game has literally no challenging gameplays, the bare bones as hell story, so it has nothing engaging for me. If there's no story for me to be gripped onto, if there's no engagement in the gameplay, even from a basic challenge perspective, then what is there for me to enjoy, right? Pokemon is already pretty easy to begin with, so when you make it even easier and take everything else away that it could be engaging, then I got nothing. I think I kind of have a funny relationship with Pokemon stories as I grew up, because of course, like any other kid my age, at the time I really liked the Pokemon anime, and every kid's dream is, being in that world, catching our own Pokemon, etc, yada yada, which is the main appeal of the games, which is why I wanted to get the games. I hadn't played any of them. I got into the series through the anime. Thing is, I'm Brazilian, and don't know if you guys know that they don't translate these games to Brazilian Portuguese, at least not officially. And when I started playing the series, I started with Black and White, then I went into X and Y and Auras eventually. And those games, story writing aside, they all have this really cool looking sort of iconography and set pieces that if you're not actually engaging with the script, you may look at it and be like, oh dang, these stories must be pretty good, because you see all these cool looking characters, these big legendaries, these beautifully portrayed visuals and backstories. And as I learned English and got a little bit more familiar with the contents of the actual games themselves, that was more or less around the meantime between Generation 6 and Generation 7 coming out. So the first games I played like this were Pokemon Super Mystery Dungeon, which again, Mystery Dungeon is well known for having a good story to begin with, and Pokemon Sun and Moon, which are also some of the more story-heavy games in the series, and probably one of the best stories in Pokemon as a whole. And those games, therefore, they defined my growing up. They were some of the first RPGs I really got into as far as, getting into the story and the characters go. So a lot of my tastes and some really valuable memories can be chalked up to those games existing. Which is why I was really disillusioned when I went back to the older games, be it the ones that I had already beaten a few times, or even the ones that I was too young to touch. And I realized that there just wasn't much to these stories. Just okay, the evil team is very generic usually, and their motivations are maybe somewhat interesting sometimes, maybe they're stupid, maybe you have to think about it. I was just disillusioned as a whole. Of course, it's more complicated than simply, oh, all the other ones have bad stories. It's a bit of a spectrum. These are all different games that came out at different times, and you see all sorts of opinions around online on each of the game's stories. Generally speaking, most of them were never really the focus. Some of the games attempt something a little different from others, and it's always a bit unique. Games like Gold and Silver might have some interesting lore, and Generation 3 has some interesting environmental implications if you really think about it in a more abstract sort of way. Every game has value as far as story goes, but as far as RPGs are concerned, they're nowhere near as story-focused as some others. Generally speaking, every game that isn't Pokemon Sun and Moon or Scarlet and Violet recently, every single Pokemon game, as far as the mainline series goes, doesn't really have that great of a story for RPG standards. Some of them might have stakes. Diamond and Pearl is a good example of the series trying to feel more like a Final Fantasy in terms of having you face gods and stuff. And Black and White proposed some interesting philosophical concepts, but it didn't really follow through with it. Even Sword and Shield being the odd one out in between the two generations I feel have the best stories. Feels like it's kicking and screaming to be able to tell the really interesting story it wants to tell, it just doesn't really have the time or budget for it. Overall, for most of the series, the story isn't really the focus, which is why most people don't care. Which is also probably why they felt comfortable with releasing a game such as Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee in 2018, with nothing as far as story goes, because that wasn't really the focus, even at that point. And when we got Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, it only made it worse, because that really just took away everything I really liked about Pokemon. Interesting characters, story, strategic combat, which brings us to today. Or more specifically, a few months ago. So by that point, I was already a strong defender of Sun and Moon, specifically for the reasons I just mentioned. I didn't really care that much about Sword and Shield, not for the same reasons everyone else seems to dislike it, but simply because the games were too short and lacked a lot of substance. So again, it kind of didn't have that stuff I was looking for, as in the story and all that cool single-player RPG stuff. Which means I actually, despite everything, enjoyed Scarlet Violet. I've made a few videos about it, but I did enjoy Scarlet Violet for what it was. I think it has some of the best characters in the entire series. I enjoy exploring the open world. Despite being messy and finished games, they have everything I'm looking for in a Pokemon game as far as giving me the experience of being a Pokemon trainer while meeting all these fun people and going through this insane character-driven story with lots of cool twists and some dark turns that are interesting to think about. You can even see it in, like, whenever I try to rank all the Pokemon games or any sort of stuff like this. Black and White is sort of good because it was the first game to try and have a deeper story, but it's also kind of non-committal to the whole thing, and it doesn't really explore its points very well, which is why you should really read the manga. And then I went back to play X and Y, realized that story has nothing to it, and the games are also disgustingly easy, so it was kind of these games I grew up with. I sort of forgot why I liked them in the first place, and that's when I sort of became hypercritical of the series as a whole, which is most Pokemon fans nowadays for one reason or another. We all have our own staunchly defined opinions, usually based on whichever games we grew up with, where people would like certain eras or certain games for certain things they did that they liked the most. Which raised a pretty interesting question in my head. Was Pokemon even that good? I've seen a lot of older fans sort of tap out of Pokemon as they get older. I've seen quite a few videos that are just about quote-unquote growing out of Pokemon that people make. And I've also seen lots of people who think they don't like JRPGs because they play Pokemon, think it's boring, and then only years later try maybe Persona or something and realize, no, they actually like the genre. Pokemon just doesn't have that much meat to it a lot of the time. Because Pokemon has this very formulaic sort of gameplay cycle, and that's not even just from game to game, but in between the actual progression in the game itself. You go through a route, and then you challenge a gym, and then you go through another route, and then you go to town, yada yada, evil team, Pokemon League, it's done. Again, if there's not that much of a story to guide you along, like, oh, I like this character, I want to see what happens to them, or something like that, then there really isn't that much to grip on, at least like theoretically or from one perspective, which was my perspective a few months ago. Because I try replaying some of the older games, get to Route 2 and realize, okay, I'm just gonna have to keep challenging these trainers and going into these random encounters and nothing is happening and what's the point? And I think, to be honest, that still stands for games like Gen 1 that have like very basic world design with nothing really interesting and the barest bones story imaginable. But seeing how many people like a lot of the old games I didn't really care for more recently, I thought there must be something about them that makes them so appealing to everyone else. I recently watched the videos by Shugels. Those two like multi-hour long reviews on Omega Ruby and Brilliant Diamond. And they're amazing deep dive video essay reviews on the games. I highly recommend them if you have the time, even if you're just trying to listen to them. And they kind of got me interested and hyped again to play one of the older Pokemon games, one of the older style Pokemon games, which is why I decided to replay Pokemon Platinum. And as I played Pokemon Platinum, I had a realization. The realization that despite the script being fairly bare bones compared to something like Generation 7, there was still a story there. And I'm not talking about a literal script type story. The game itself provides the building blocks for your own story. The kind of thing that's unique to video games, or actually games as a whole, because the story in these older Pokemon games is the gameplay. Let me try to explain this with an example. I used to Dungeon Master for a D&D group not too long ago, and to be honest, I wasn't the best at it. Well, it's not like it was terrible, but I think I fundamentally misunderstood the appeal of the game and the interest of the table at the time. Because as a writer and as, again, a linear JRPG fan, I try to build these grand linear stories with fun characters the players are going to meet. Basically try to create this epic narrative first and a good game session second. And I'd focus a lot on my NPCs and all my crazy plot twists that I had in my head that I wanted to show to everyone. And by the halfway point of the campaign, we had this 10-man band of characters that not everyone liked or cared for. It took focus away from the player characters, which ultimately just made for a worse game overall. This brings me back to the whole idea of defining an RPG, a role-playing game. All Japanese role-playing games, which is what I mostly come from and what I mostly get into, try to minimize the actual roleplay part in favor of a more realized linear story. You're still role-playing in the sense that you're being part of this world, but the appeal is seeing it through a gameplay perspective rather than actually affecting it on noticeable terms. And they're great. I still love JRPGs, but they're not the only way to do it. Look at how Western RPG video games do it. For example, Skyrim and the like. They might have some deep lore and stuff, but the appeal is in the freedom. The appeal is in making your own story through gameplay. Oh, I met this weird guy and it sent me on a very unique quest and I did all these crazy things and then went into this dungeon and found this cool sword. Rather than, oh my god, I love the characters in the party in this game. They're so endearing. The main character has a really cool arc. It's different, you know? Reminds me of something like Breath of the Wild, which isn't exactly an RPG, but Zelda is a series that kind of treads a line between adventure game and RPG in a lot of ways. And Breath of the Wild was infamously story-light, but what made that game really appealing when it came out was the freedom it provided, with stuff like letting you basically do anything whenever you wanted in that game. The freedom is all yours and you get to make your own story. Everyone has their little stories in Breath of the Wild of little weird things they did that happened to them, the different ways they could solve the puzzles or different orders they could discover things. Stuff like finding Eventide Island and having to deal with not having any of your items for this whole challenge. That's unique and that's also, you know, a type of narrative. But in between the more linear JRPG type storytelling and the more freedom-based Skyrim or Breath of the Wild storytelling, we have Pokemon that sits squarely in the middle of that. It's a game that's strongly marketed to kids, and it's also very rooted in its retro origins with the Game Boy games. And it provides a lot of freedom with the team building aspect of it all, you know, the Pokemon aspect of Pokemon. And initially had very little dialogue. Looking at the older games, we started more and more getting more of a deeper story. But starting with Gen 1, the appeal of Pokemon was never the dialogue, and there was never that much of it to begin with. And what surprised me about Platinum was when I was playing it again, I was enthralled. Not by any particular dialogue or character writing, but just by exploring the world, listening to the music and getting the vibes. Building my team and seeing it grow as I faced each challenge that came my way was oddly cathartic in a way that's not simply defined by, oh, this character arc is good. No, it's not about character arc, it's about my story and my growth as I experience this game. Okay, the characters might be one note or whatever, but they are not the focus. The focus is on the player and how they build their own team and how their story concludes as they face each challenge along the way. It's about exploring the world and thinking about what's the next big goal and how to face it. It brought me back to simpler times when I simply enjoyed Pokemon for being Pokemon. And I spent hours playing, just getting lost in the experience. Seeing my team grow as I explored this soothing, serene world with all these just incredible vibes was great in a different way from all the more deeply written RPGs I'm more used to. I did neglect to mention that I decided to play Renegade Platinum instead of base game Platinum, which is a fairly popular difficulty ROM hack that adds some things here and there. And I also used an emulator with the speed up tool in some points whenever the game got too boring and I had to face all the generic trainers along the routes. But there's a good reason for that. Pokemon games are still overall pretty easy if you're used to them. And they are also really slow. Again, I still believe that that lack of story, that lack of substance in the older games can be really detrimental if you're not willing to deal with all the things that make it just sort of a huge commitment. If you're playing something like a Final Fantasy, you're committing to a long game, yeah, but you're gonna get great memories out of it, characters you're never gonna forget, and every single step of the way is gonna be engaging in one way or another. Meanwhile, Pokemon can sometimes feel like it's just dragging on and on and on and on. Okay, the appeal is seeing your team grow, but if nothing is challenging you, and nothing is really happening as far as the world and characters go, then what's the point? Which I think is the real appeal of all the difficulty hacks and Nuzlocke challenges Pokemon fans do when they replay these games. For those who don't know, Nuzlocke challenges are basically when people play Pokemon games, but they usually add a permadeath mechanic or some other out there rules to make the game a little bit more challenging. And again, that's because these games are huge time and patience commitments for adults. And I think the existence of these really encapsulates my point here. When you first play a Pokemon game as a kid and you don't understand most mechanics or how things work, it can be a real engaging challenge just making it through and building your own team and going through the obstacles that come with that. As we grow and get more comfortable with the mechanics and just overall get smarter, we realize that these games aren't that hard to crack, and therefore the experience becomes more stale. But at least in the case of Nuzlocke, it also goes to show how flexible this game design is and how far the quote-unquote Breath of the Wild ability of these games really goes. Because okay, with the difficulty ROM hacks, that's another thing entirely. They're messing with the game's code, that's different. But as far as Nuzlocke goes, you can literally just grab any copy of any official mainline Pokemon game and do a Nuzlocke run just fine. The game is flexible enough to allow you to do that. And that's how a lot of adult fans have figured out a way to keep having that nice new Pokemon experience with going in your own journey in a way that's still challenging and engaging for their, I guess, more developed minds. Just look at how many YouTubers do Nuzlocke runs and then recap them in like animation formats and stuff like that, and how engaging those can be as a form of storytelling even. When you're a kid, it doesn't matter how much time you need to do stuff. You don't get bored as easily, and simply using your free weekend to play a video game is all you can really do. To make a game worth it for someone that maybe has a lot more stuff to do or has to juggle between different hobbies and different interests, playing games that are so simple can definitely be disengaging, which I think is the source of people growing out of Pokemon or not getting the appeal of Pokemon when they try to play it and think they just don't like RPGs. I'll be honest, it's the difficulty hack is even how I prefer to play even the games I really do like for the story, such as Sun and Moon, because they just add that extra spark, that little bit of additional engagement that makes the game as a whole a lot more enjoyable if you ask me, which is why I prefer to basically have my cake and eat it too. If I'm able to have a game that both has an engaging world, challenging gameplay, and gives me a good sense of progression within the gameplay, but also provides me a cool story with fun characters and all that. That's just a full package if you ask me. Look at how Zelda Tears of the Kingdom Breath of the Wild sequel kind of disappointed me for just basically doing the same thing as Breath of the Wild, despite marketing itself as this big new take. It does a lot of cool different things from a gameplay perspective, but through the lack of any substantial additions when it came to the campaign, that game, no matter how good it actually was, it disappointed me and a lot of other people for feeling like it was lacking not only in continuity, but in providing a differently substantial story experience from its prequel. This whole realization did not lower my love for Sun and Moon or Scarlet and Violet, but it simply gave me a deeper appreciation for these older games that I used to just write off as slow, unsubstantial games that I enjoyed but would rather never replay again. Alola still has some immaculate vibes in the world exploration, and I believe Scarlet and Violet does strike a nice balance between having a lot of good story moments and not being the insane cutscene fest that Gen 7 was. meaning that those games, despite being more story-focused, still have some of that gameplay-focused appeal and narrative that you can get in the older games. As I said, Gen 1 is still a little too basic for me, but now I see how someone could just feel otherwise. Alola's text walls and Scarlet Violet's Fortnite maps can take away from that pure Pokemon adventure, just going out there and seeing your team grow and choosing whichever mons you're gonna take along this time. There's an intrinsic appeal to that, one that I sort of forgot about as I grew up. If you're purely looking for that ludic Pokemon adventure experience, the generations like Gen 4, Gen 3, and arguably Gen 5 are definitely still better than the glitchy mess of Scarlet and Violet and the slow-paced Sun and Moon. The story is definitely less intrusive and more subtle. The dialogue mostly serves to be a fun icebreaker than anything else. It doesn't take itself too seriously, but that's intentional. That's the game trying to just give you a little bit of fun between your adventuring and all your exploring. It doesn't have to have these meaningful character arcs. And all the meaningful stuff comes from more so little narrative harmony than anything explicit in the text itself. One famous example is Silver's Golbat, which evolves into a Crobat in between the points in the story where he finally understands the value of bonds and friendship with his Pokemon. For those who don't know, Golbat is a Pokemon that only evolves through friendship evolutions, and you can see how that's a lot more subtle and potentially even more meaningful than, for example, Gladion's intricate character arc with his whole edgy phase and caring for his sister and his whole relationship with Lucamine and the player character Guzma, who himself has an intricate relationship with Professor Kukui and the trial challenges as a whole, and it's a whole complicated mess that's fun to analyze, but you see how that's completely different from that little touch that is Silver's Crobat. Basically, the moral of the story here is that you should really just sit down and try to understand others. For the longest time, I couldn't see the value in those older Pokemon game stories because I didn't look at them from the right perspective. I was looking for things that simply weren't there, and I missed the appeal entirely. On the flip side, I also think people who enjoy games like Platinum more than stuff like Sun and Moon should try and take a look at the more story-heavy games and try to see what I see in them, as far as how that deeper character building can also make for a pretty interesting game in a different way from the other ones. And these can coexist, and we can all be fans of the same property for different reasons in different ways and still enjoy what makes these games good in our own ways, but also recognizing that maybe our favorite aspects aren't the only ones that can make an experience absolutely great. Part of what makes media and art as a whole just beautiful is how unique each piece can be. Sometimes some games or movies or shows simply don't work for you the same way they work for other people, but it's still worth looking into them and see if you can find something to enjoy about them, even if you don't love them as much as other things that maybe just appeal to you more personally. In the end, it's just nice to be a more understanding person, and sometimes all it takes for you to do that is a little change in perspective. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time.